Hey, what's going on, guys? Tukey here, back again. Welcome back to the channel. And today, I got something a little bit different for you. If you are anything like me, over the past 24 to 36 hours, you have been looking for a bit of a distraction to take the attention away from, frankly, horrific events. And my way of distracting myself has been to, of course, just kind of stay busy, watch some videos, and a YouTuber that I've watched for quite a long time now, by the name of one KTO, put out this video yesterday ranking every NFL team's performance since 2000. First and foremost, tremendous video. This video will not be looking to rip it off directly. I couldn't even begin to put in the technical work that he did behind the video. First and foremost, great channel. Check out that video. But that idea got me thinking, well, hey, what would the NHL version of that look like? And when it comes to trying to distract yourself from horrible things, let me tell you, the data entry is a pretty good way to do it. So I took a pretty similar formula to what he used in the video. We're ranking championships, conference championships, division titles, the amount of playoff appearances, the amount of playoff wins, and seeing where each of the 32 and a little bonus team, seeing where they would stack up on this list. Like I said, I needed something to distract myself with, and this worked out pretty damn well. So let's get down to it. You understand the basic concept of what we're ranking here and the inspiration for it. And let's start off with the teams in the 6 tier, F tier. I'm labeling it the doldrums because these are the teams that over the last 25 years, dating back to the 1999-2000 NHL season, have had just essentially no success whatsoever. But of course, there are a couple of examples because this tier also consists of the incompletes. And there is an NA tab for a reason. And that NA tab is going to be occupied by the Seattle Kraken. Obviously, the NHL's most recent franchise. There's not a ton to say there. They have literally played in 14 playoff games and have won half of them. But by looking at the metrics that we're looking at, they would obviously be at the very bottom in F tier as well, but it doesn't feel fair to put Seattle there at this point. You could also argue it doesn't feel fair to put our little bonus team into F tier, that being the Atlanta Thrashers, but unlike Seattle, their story is complete, and it was a disastrous story for the Thrashers. You are talking about a team that won one division title in their history and proceeded to get swept in the first round. One division title, 4 playoff games, no wins. Absolutely atrocious. Now, when we get to Winnipeg, I'll talk about where the combined lineage could have ranked. But yeah, shout out to Atlanta. I mean, any excuse to talk about the Thrashers is a good excuse, but boy, I wonder why they didn't have a ton of support, and then the ownership group sucked, and then the team moved. I wonder why that happened. Team number 31, also in F tier, because the Thrashers couldn't be alone. This one sucks, given the circumstances. It's the Columbus Blue Jackets. I don't think a lot of people have realized how bad Blue Jackets fans have had it from a strictly on-ice perspective. Let's not try to sit here and tie this into tragedies, but from a strictly on-ice perspective, this is a team that has played in just 41 playoff games and won 15 of them in the club's lifetime. You can go into the history of the team. They got dealt a really rough hand as an expansion team. You get Rick Nash. You can't really do much else from there. They get a bit of a revival and stuff like that. But overall, it's been rough. And honestly, it's commendable that the Blue Jackets, support that fan base is as strong as it is, because they have been given very, very little, again, from a strictly on ice perspective. And the last team that's in consideration here for the bottom is the Winnipeg Jets. Now, if you were to combine Winnipeg and Atlanta, this team would be moved up into D tier, and they would jump the first team in D tier, but they still wouldn't be that much further up the board. So I figured, why not keep them separated? Of course, in the words of the Offspring. But when it comes to Winnipeg, 49 playoff games since they relocated back, 18 wins, 0 division titles in that time. We've yet to talk about a team that's won a division aside from Atlanta, which is funny. That team had it rough out of the gates in terms of, okay, once they moved from Atlanta, I mean, you had a couple of pieces here and there, but not really a ton. They put it together, and then, of course, it didn't quite work out, and we'll see where they go, of course, now that they elected to keep the likes of Connor Hellebuck and everything. But overall, it's been rough for Jets fans since they've gotten the team back, aside from a few glimpses of maybe something just a little bit better. Shockingly, as we move into our next couple of teams, the D tier, which I'm labeling one magical run, because outside of that, there hasn't been too much else to celebrate. And we kick things off with our dearly departed Phoenix/Arizona Coyotes. Of course, now the Utah Hockey Club. They're saying it's a brand new lineage and everything because apparently T.J. Ginla's their first ever draft pick. Whatever, who cares? Because the Coyotes might come back eventually. It won't be under the Maruellos because, my God, the incompetence was staggering. You were hoping that it wasn't true, but ultimately it was. Wishful thinking could only go so far. But for the Coyotes, in their history, one division title, 46 playoff games, just 18 wins, and we labeled it one magical run because, of course, they had their one big conference final run where they ended up losing to LA in the 2012 Western Conference Final. Outside of that, bleak for the Coyotes in their history. Next up, the New York Islanders. And for fans of a certain age, I mean, the Islanders were a terror. 4 straight Stanley Cups, end of the 70s, into the 80s, just that dominant core. Of course, we talked about that team a lot. If you missed one of the last videos I did that was non-franchise, I ranked the greatest Stanley Cup championship teams of all time. What was the most dominant team? Go check that video out if you haven't. It was a good amount of work. But again, another one of those, hey, let's use statistical research to get through a rough time. But for the New York Islanders over the last 25 years, 106 playoff games, 47 wins. And again, they had those moments a couple of years ago where they were starting to really be threatening, but they just could not get to that next level around, COVID time especially. And then aside from that, and one John Tavares goal to help them beat the Florida Panthers, it's been a really, really rough time for the New York Islanders. And our final team in this D tier ended up being the Minnesota Wild. Outside of 2003 and making it all the way to the Western Conference Final, you're talking about a team that has just one division title since they've been back. 96 playoff games, just 34 wins. It's kind of shocking just how mid at best they've been for the vast majority of their time. I mean, especially too, like I was old enough to remember when they first became a team, and it's like, oh, you have Marian Gaborik to build around. Now there's Kirill Kaprizov, and hopefully for Wild fans, they finally get something aside from, again, retiring Patrick Waugh over 20 years ago now. So rough times for those fan bases overall. We get to the C tier, aka the so close but could not sustain any form of success. And so close fits the theme here, except for this first team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, I was a bit surprised to see the Leafs here. They have 2 division titles over the last 25 years, and that was, when Sundin was still there. So you're talking, before the 2004-2005 lockout. 127 playoff games in that time with 59 wins. Primarily, they are here off of the back of the core that they have put together over the last near decade. Yes, only one playoff series victory in that time, but at the same time, they've been incredibly consistent compared to what they were before, right? You have that consistency of making the playoffs, often going to 7 games against the Bruins. It's helped kind of push them out of those lower ranks, but obviously still not ideal for a team that's had the hopes and aspirations that they've had. Which brings us to another team I was a bit surprised wasn't in D tier just for the misery, and that's the Buffalo Sabres. But again, we are talking about 25 years worth of hockey here, and for the Sabres, that does mean we are at the very end of a 25-year window that includes their trip to the Stanley Cup Final. It's rough, certainly. 2 division titles in that time as well boosts them up 65 playoff games, 29 wins. I don't have to explain the pain that Sabres fans have gone through, and it's been obviously a long time since Sabres fans have seen playoff hockey, outside of course, 2006, 2007 when the team was looking pretty good, and it just never happened to click from there. Next up, the Edmonton Oilers in that C tier, despite 2 trips to a Stanley Cup final, where obviously they did not win either. 0 division titles in the last 25 years. 2 trips to the Cup final, 0 division titles. They have not won their division at any point in the past 10 years. You've had Connor McDavid for almost 10 years. I genuinely couldn't believe it. I didn't realize 115 playoff games in that time, 57 wins. Obviously, when they've been making the playoffs, they have been decent. But as Oilers fans know, there were many, many years where this team was not making the playoffs. But it is obviously that reemergence over the last couple of seasons, getting a lot more playoff games with McDavid, Draisaitl, and company that push them here, as opposed to still being in Minnesota territory, if not lower. You adjust this 25-year window in terms of what years we're looking at, and all of a sudden it could be a lot worse for Edmonton. We have Calgary just above them, but in the same tier. 1 trip to a Cup final. Was the puck in? It might have been. 3 division titles over the last 25 years, 94 playoff games, and 41 wins, just above their they're in province, another provincial rival. Again, some lean years for Calgary outside of the trip to the Cup final, and just not a whole heck of a lot going on since. I mean, again, we talked about it, 94 playoff games. That's less than what we've seen from Toronto. They've played 2 less playoff games than Minnesota in the last 25 years, which is just kind of surprising to me. They're very much in those middle tiers at this stage. At another C spot, I was going to say, I think they were 22nd ranked overall, as we just threw that all over the place. The Nashville Predators are next. If frickin' tier, there you go, you beautiful website, you. Nashville also finds themselves in the C tier. Like I said, you could kind of deem this the so close but couldn't sustain it category. Obviously, they made a trip to the Stanley Cup final, lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who we'll talk about much, much later on in terms of who, of course, has been the most successful. But 1 trip to the final, 2 division titles in that time, 131 playoff games, 56 wins. There were, again, some off years where things weren't going so great, but it is surprising that a team that had the goaltending that they've had consistently for the vast majority of the 25 years, even before Pekka Rinne got there with the likes of Thomas Vokoun, that they weren't able to make it happen. And then you factor in the defenders that they had between the Shea Webbers, the Roman Yossi's. It's just really, really surprising that all they've been able to muster is that 1 run. But they were another team that had a really rough start in terms of how expansion drafts worked back in the day. They've obviously been able to, do a little bit better for themselves compared to the likes of Minnesota and Columbus. So not all bad. And our final team in the C tier, the Ottawa Senators. 1 trip to the Cup final in 2007, 3 division titles, 129 playoff games with 64 wins. Another organization that you look at it, and really that's kind of the common theme amongst these 6 teams in the C tier is at one point or another, maybe sometimes at multiple points, they had this good group of talent that they just could not find the missing pieces for to get to that next level and win themselves a Stanley Cup. It's got to be frustrating, right? I view the C tier as easily the most frustrating, right? Because Minnesota, okay, you had a couple of star players, stuff like that. You haven't really been able to put the pieces around. The Islanders, same thing. The Coyotes, you had obviously all the inconsistency with ownership and stuff like that. But with these 6 teams, there's a legitimate argument of being a piece or two or one big trade, one big signing away, or in the case of Edmonton, getting a GM that isn't out of his goddamn mind. Shout out to Ken Holland. What a guy. That just has to be the most frustrating fan base, the group of fan bases in that C tier, just to know, like, damn, they were close. But there is an argument for the B tier as well. And we kick things off there with Montreal just making it to the cut here. And actually, technically, with the formula that I had here, they and the Rangers ended up with the same point total, so they're kind of interchangeable. Montreal, 1 conference title, technically a trip to the Stanley Cup final, 4 division titles in that time, 143 playoff games, and 66 wins. Kind of that next step up, right? Where they had that little bit of extra consistency that the teams in the C tier struggled to find, or they at least didn't have the overly, extended periods of just doing absolutely nothing. And of course, a big part of that was Carey Price at one point being the best goaltender in the world. But again, they just couldn't do enough to get to that next tier. They were a little bit more consistent than the teams in the C tier, but not quite good enough to get that cup win and get into the A tier. And with the Rangers, obviously a very similar story with a Hall of Fame level goaltender in Henrik Lundqvist, but just not being able to put those pieces together, while again, not having a sustained period of just not being all that good, like we've seen with Toronto, Buffalo, Edmonton, etc. Rangers, by the way, 3 division titles in this time, 175 playoff games, 84 wins. Very, very good. And obviously the last couple of seasons help, because if you look back at the Rangers, end of the 90s into the early 2000s, before that 04-05 lockout, they were in a massive, massive playoff drought. So a lot more success in the Lundqvist era, and then obviously now in more recent years. Of course, they won their division this past season. Ahead of them, we have the Philadelphia Flyers, 1 conference title in their time, 4 division titles, 166 playoff games with 81 wins, and outside of one of the most ridiculous goals ever in the form of Patrick Kane's 2010 Cup winner. Again, a bit more sustained success. A little bit surprising that they weren't able to put it together and get the job done with some of the teams that they had, especially, talking about like between 2009, 2012, stuff like that. Like, they did have some damn good teams that just couldn't get it done. And here comes the outlier in the B tier. The only team in the B tier that has won a Stanley Cup recently, the Vegas Golden Knights. It's crazy. Like, talk about outliers. A Stanley Cup for them, 2 trips to the final already, of course, 3 division titles, 92 playoff games, and 54 wins in that time. It is insane how quickly, because obviously we're talking about 25 years of history here. They don't even have 10. Just how quickly they've rose up the ranks. Not always the most popular of ways that they've done that in terms of team construction, arguments about the fan base. Shout out to One Sim for the win and all the other Sharks fans that are like, oh, I hate this goddamn team. Bottom line is, though, they did get the results by winning the Stanley Cup now 2 years ago, or I guess last year, 2 seasons ago, we shall say. And it's just a crazy run for them to be where they are in the mix with these teams as we talk about our last 2, which is Vancouver and the San Jose Sharks. The peak of, my God, this site just does not want to cooperate here. Please, thank you. The peak of looking really damn good, having a damn good core, and just not being able to get it done. With Vancouver, you talk about the one trip to the final in 2011. They had 8 division titles over the last 25 years, 135 playoff games, 64 playoff wins. A lot of down years in the aftermath of ownership and management being idiots and trying to toughen up the team instead of just rolling with what got them to the Cup final in the first place. And outside of that, who knows? They've better management. They might have actually won a Cup in the early to mid 2010s. But at the end of the day, very, very consistent when they were at their best. And of course, the Sharks, just a slightly better example of that in terms of just the amount of playoff games. 6 division titles, but 204 playoff games with 104 wins. The most competitive franchise to not win a Stanley Cup over the last 25 years. And that's what you can look at with this B tier. Again, with the exception of Vegas, who has won. These other 5 teams, those fan bases, rightfully frustrated and should be at the fact that, how the hell didn't we win at least one Stanley Cup? The window was there. C tier, the window was there, but it's that was kind of fluky, maybe a little bit, right? We can see why. B tier, though, those 5 fan bases outside of Vegas, of course, very, very, very close and very, very frustrating. We get to the A tier, and we start off with the most recent Stanley Cup champions, the Florida Panthers, and how crazy it is to see them up here, given that things changed very, very quickly for them. You look in the early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, even heading towards the 2010s, and just the lack of any playoff appearances whatsoever. But they have a Stanley Cup now. Of course, they made the last 2 Cup finals, which helps them a lot. 4 division titles, and over the last 25 years, just 82 playoff games, but they've won half of them with 41. So when they make it, they do very, very well, as indicated by the fact that, of course, in their lifetime, they've made 3 Stanley Cup finals. Shout out to my pen that just hit the floor. This isn't a video I don't plan on editing at all. This is practically a podcast. But yeah, Florida Panthers, off the back of winning the Stanley Cup, find themselves this much higher up. And even 5 years ago, who would have thought, right, that you'd see the likes of the Florida Panthers in kind of the Stanley Cup winning category. Just a crazy, crazy run for them. At number 13, I believe, technically, in the A tier as well, St. Louis, also here off the strength of winning a Stanley Cup in their only appearance, of course, making Brad Marchand cry. 4 division titles, 154 playoff games with 71 wins. One of those teams that easily could have found themselves in B tier, right? I mean, you don't have that cup. You're right there with the Canucks, the Sharks, the Flyers of just God damn it, we could have done something there. But they did it, and they made Brad Marchand cry. So there's that. Next up, also in the A tier, the Los Angeles Kings. This one is surprising, given the fact, of course, that they won 2 cups in 2012 and 2014. But over the last 25 years, no division titles. Much like the Oilers, goose-egged on division titles. In the last 25 years, the Atlanta Thrashers won a division title, but the Kings, who have won 2 cups, have not. 127 playoff games, 62 wins, very similar. When they make it, they do incredibly well. Could have easily found themselves in a different tier, but they made the most of their opportunities, and that's going to get Jonathan Quick into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Next up, the Carolina Hurricanes over a team that has 2 Stanley Cups. The reason why is, of course, the Hurricanes with 2 trips to the final, 2002 and 2006, winning in 2006. And in between that time, 5 division titles, 146 playoff games, 77 wins. Another team hovering around that 50%. When they make it, they do well. Some down years, but for the most part, they have been an incredibly strong, incredibly consistent team. And again, they're ahead of LA primarily based on the fact that they've, you could argue, have they necessarily been a better regular season team, or did they just happen to win weaker divisions? Who's to say? You could make that argument. There's some fault in the logic here. But hey, as anybody will tell you, when it comes to something like this, you always leave room open for someone to say, that's stupid, it should have been done this way. That way, they comment on things. Am I right, NHL Network, and your player rankings every year? God, at least try to hide it. At least I tried. Be subtle about it for once. Jesus. Next up, the Dallas Stars. Of course, a Stanley Cup in 1999. And technically 3 trips to the Cup final because they made it in the 2000 final, losing to New Jersey. And, of course, made a bubble final as well, which is weird to think about. 6 division titles as well. 181 playoff games, 92 playoff wins. So, again, hovering around that 50%. Obviously, they had some down years, late 2000s, 2010s, and everything like that. But they've definitely bounced back as well over the past couple of seasons. Helped boost that ranking up a little bit. The next team we have in the A tier, the Anaheim Ducks, a Stanley Cup in 2007. 3 trips to the Cup final. 2 trips in the Cup final. I got too far ahead of my notes there. 2 trips to the Cup final. 2003, obviously losing to the Devils, and then winning the Cup in 2007. 6 division titles in that time. 143 playoff games. 85 wins. And really stellar win percentage. Solid in the regular season. Got it done in the playoffs as well. Winning a Cup. Shouldn't be really a surprise to see them up there. Speaking of division titles, the Washington Capitals take the crown for that. I couldn't believe this. Obviously winning the Stanley Cup in 2018, the only time that they have made the Stanley Cup final in the last 25 years. They obviously made it just a little bit before our cutoff date. 12 division titles in that time. Part of me now, even though I've triple checked it, still thinks it's a typo. But apparently it's not. 165 playoff games, 75 wins. They've just been really, really good. And I think to a lot of people, right, it's one of those things where it's like, man, if it wasn't for the Penguins, how many cups would the Capitals have won? At least how many times would they have made it to the finals if they didn't keep running into Sidney Crosby and company, particularly in the second round, year after year. And our final team in this A tier, the kind of got at least one Stanley Cup tier, the Boston Bruins, on their way up to the A tier. Fact of the matter is, I don't know if people know this or not, Boston sports fans have been pretty spoiled, right? The Bruins, 3 trips to the Cup final since 2011. Of course, losing some more. Losing to Chicago in 2013 and St. Louis in 2019. But 8 division titles and one of a few teams to have an ungodly 205 playoff games played over the last 25 years with 108 wins. Literally all it would have taken was just one more win to put him into S tier. There's even kind of an argument. I mean, they have been so damn consistent. The fall off's going to come eventually. Probably. They're certainly trying to postpone that. Sign Jeremy Swayman, please. Please. But yeah, I feel like that's works out pretty well as we get into talking about S tier. And we start off with a bit of a surprise. Technically, the bottom of S tier, Chicago. Now, some people will be like, excuse me, sir. They have 3 cups and only 2 other teams have done that. So how would they technically not be in the top 3 of S tier? The reason for that, 3 division titles, which is the lowest of any of the teams we're going to talk about in S tier, and just 142 playoff games, the lowest of any team in S tier. So as a result, the least amount of wins in the playoffs with 81 out of their 142 games. When they have made the playoffs, especially in that run between 2010 and 2015, they were essentially unbeatable. But as Hawks fans will tell you, before Taves and Kane got there, very rough. And then obviously the last couple of years leading up to getting Connor Bedard, also very rough. But when they were at their peak, goddamn dynasty. right? Modern day dynasty for Chicago. Next up, the Colorado Avalanche, of course, also finding themselves in S tier. 2 Stanley Cups in that time. 2001, Raymond Bourque, the best cup lift of all time. And, of course, most recently, a few years ago, with the likes of Nathan MacKinnon and company. But in that time, hey, 2 for 2. They make the cup finals. They win it. But 8 division titles, 189 playoff games, 107 wins, a tremendous ratio. They had some lean years as well. You know, once you talk about Joe Sakic moving on from the team, before you get your Landeskog's, McKinnon's, Makar's in place, there was some rough years, but they've made the most of it, obviously, right? They've been a consistent threat to win the cup now for the past 5 years or so, and obviously got the job done at least once. So shouldn't really be a surprise to see Colorado up there for both recency bias and in general in the last 25 years. Up next, the New Jersey Devils. I mean, we're still, based off a 25-year scale, getting to factor in the Martin Brodeur era. Of course, in the last 25 years, they've made the Stanley Cup final 4 times, won the cup twice, 6 division titles, 161 playoff games, 85 wins. Obviously, you talk about the more recent years, and you know, as that 25-year scale starts to not factor in the early 2000s anymore, they're going to start tumbling down that list unless the current core that they have can kind of figure things out a little bit. But given the time frame that we're talking about, they're still very much factored in. We get to the top 3. Up next, Detroit, another team benefiting from the 25-year scale. 2 Stanley Cups, 3 finals appearances in that time, of course, only losing to the Pittsburgh Penguins. 9 division titles, 182 playoff games with 97 wins. When you get to factor in arguably the greatest cup team of all time, got to go check out that video to find out if they're number 1, though, with the 2002 Red Wings. You factor in the 2008 team, of course, that beat Crosby and the Penguins. You factor in the streak that they had playing a big part. Again, another team where, you know, certainly Red Wings fans are getting anxious to see that team finally get back into the playoffs. And as that 25-year scale continues to go, and all of a sudden, oh man, you don't have the strength of that 2002 team, you start to tumble a little bit. But for now, because of that window, they're still looking pretty good. Now, you can say that these are kind of in order. I guess they are. I guess they aren't. Let's talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins, though, next, right? I think these are probably the 2 teams, the Penguins and the Lightning, that people would have expected to see at the top of a list like this. Pittsburgh with 3 Stanley Cups in the last 25 years, having made the finals 4 times. 4 division titles, because Alex Ovechkin is a freak, but a team high, a league high, 219 playoff games played with 118 wins. Sidney Crosby, man. You look early on, pre-04-05 lockout, it's a little bit rough, but just how consistent this team has been. Yes, they've missed the playoffs over the last 2 years, but how consistent this team has been in the Crosby era. The Cups, I mean, again, another dynasty, right, in the form of Pittsburgh. But you can argue that Tampa has managed to surpass them. 3 Stanley Cups on their own, 5 trips to the Stanley Cup final in that time. 2004, 2015, back-to-back, and then losing to Colorado when the Avs won their most recent cup. I mean, they nearly pulled off the three-peat. 4 division titles in that time, 210 playoff games with 120 wins. I don't think anybody will be surprised, right, when we're talking about essentially the most successful teams of the last 25 years, to see the likes of Tampa and Pittsburgh up this high. You could even make an argument that there should just be a tier for those 2 teams, right? I mean, and that might factor in a little bit more recency bias because we are removed a bit, especially from Detroit and New Jersey's championships. But all things considered, kind of like the way this panned out. And I mean, you look at a list like this and you factor in the last 25 years, kind of makes sense, right? S tier, you're talking about the teams with multiple cups. A tier, teams that have at least won once. B tier, very, very successful teams that didn't quite make it. We talked about how this is shaped up. And again, I couldn't do Seattle dirty by putting them in F tier, at least not yet. But yeah, like I said, I was looking for a distraction, so I went through and kind of found out this data for myself because I was intrigued. And hey, hopefully you're intrigued as well, and let me know if you think there are any kind of faults to what we're factoring in here. And like I said, you could probably find some shortcomings with only looking at division titles because, well, how do you measure the strength of conferences and stuff like that? And divisions, I mean, hey, who's to say? But anyway, hopefully, how long has this been? Hopefully this near 40 minute, 30 minute, 30, 40 minute, hopefully this randomness served you well. And we'll be back soon to talk more hockey stuff. Franchise stuff isn't going away. NHL 25 is going to be on the horizon. What do I have planned for that? Find out soon when I find out, because I don't plan anything. Planning is a smart thing to do, so why would I do that? In case you can't tell, I've been very tired throughout this. I'm going to go to bed now, and poor Thrashers fans, man, eh? God, they never had a chance.